and welcome to the inaugural edition of Clinical Corner. This is going to be a regular installment from AES produced by the Treatments Committee. I'm your host this evening. I'm Dr. Barry Gidal, Professor of Pharmacy at University of Wisconsin. And I'll introduce my colleagues in just a moment. Now, as many of you know, the last month or so, we've seen some important advances in our treatment of COVID, specifically the introduction of 2 oral antiviral agents. Now, our purpose today is not to discuss the treatment of COVID, but rather we're going to discuss what are some of the implications of these new therapies in the management of our patients with epilepsy. And to help us address that, I'm honored to be joined tonight by Dr. David Vossler, Clinical Professor of Neurology at University of Washington, and Dr. Jon Cokley, who's a clinical pharmacist at Texas Children's Hospital and a clinical instructor at Baylor College of Medicine. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
I'm going to start off with Jon. Can you tell us a little bit about these new antiviral agents and generally what their indications are and what their contraindications are? And perhaps we'll start with the drug Paxlovid.
Sure. So there's 2 new products that are available. Paxlovid received its EUA approval on December 22nd, followed by molnupiravir, which was got its EUA approval on December 23rd. So Paxlovid is approved for patients with mild to moderate COVID-19, and it's specifically geared towards treatment to help prevent the risk of progression to serious illness or to hospitalization. It's approved for patients that are 12 years of age and older and those that are greater than 40 kilos. And it's actually a combination product of nirmatrelvir and ritonavir, which is an HIV antiretroviral therapy that's used almost like a booster. And then the second product, molnupiravir, is also indicated, but it's only for adult patients to help prevent progression.
Okay. Are there any contraindications to these agents?
Sure. So Paxlovid, because it has that booster component to it, it is something that has contraindications based off of drug-drug interactions. Piravir is only something that is contraindicated for patients that are pregnant.
Okay, great. All right, so let's talk about drug interactions. So Dave, I'm going to turn this to you now. Because of these potential drug interactions, I'm going to break this into a couple questions. First, let's start with what would you anticipate the impact of some of our commonly used anti-seizure medications on Paxlovid?
Okay, great question, and thank you, Barry. I'm happy to take that. The first major consideration really is that, like many medications, Paxlovid is metabolized by the hepatic isozyme CYP3A4. So consequently, anti-seizure medications that are strong CYP3A4 inducers can have a negative influence on the effectiveness of Paxlovid. So you'll see here in the table, in the top left corner, we've listed the strong enzyme-inducing anti-seizure medications, which are carbamazepine, phenobarbital, phenytoin, and primidone. Now, primidone's not specifically called out in the FDA's EUA for Paxlovid, but primidone breaks down to phenobarbital, and it is a strong enzyme-inducing anti-seizure medication. So the problem is that by inducing CYP3A4, these 4 older anti-seizure medications, if the patient is taking them, those drugs could potentially decrease the effectiveness of Paxlovid by decreasing its plasma concentration. And so the Paxlovid could lose effectiveness or could reduce its so-called virologic response. And so this drug reduced concentration of Paxlovid also could lead to drug resistance. So it's for that reason that these strong enzyme-inducing ASMs are contraindicated for use with Paxlovid.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly makes sense, because if we draw upon the HIV experience, that reduced antiviral activity of ritonavir and a couple other of the drugs. So we'll have to wait and see what plays out here. Okay, so let me turn the question around a little bit. What would you anticipate the effect of Paxlovid on other medications, specifically, our anti-seizure medications?
Right. So that's really the second main consideration, is that Paxlovid is an inhibitor of CYP3A4. And we have numerous medications that are numerous anti-seizure medications specifically that are metabolized by CYP3A4. And I think Jon's going to talk about that, and he'll show a table in a little more detail later. But basically, the anti-seizure medications that are predominantly metabolized by CYP3A4 include cannabidiol, carbamazepine, clonazepam, diazepam, ethosuximide, everolimus, felbamate, lacosamide, midazolam, oxcarbazepine, perampanel, stiripentol, tiagabine, and zonisamide. So it's quite a long list, as you can see. So patients that are receiving these anti-seizure medications, again, because Paxlovid can inhibit their metabolism, the concern is that their plasma levels will rise. And it's important because ritonavir is an potent inhibitor of CYP3A4. So concentrations of these drugs could rise. And if the drug is extensively metabolized by CYP3A4, this could lead to serious and even potentially life-threatening events. And so for that reason, these drugs are contraindicated for use with Paxlovid.
Okay. So Jon, let me turn back to you. So David's brought up about the issue of the strong inducers. What are your thoughts about the more, let's call them modest, CYP3A4 inducers? I'm going to ask you a two-part question here. What do we think about them? What do we think the potential impact could be? Would there be a difference? And might that depend on the dose of these modest inducers? What are your thoughts?
So more modest inducers, thinking at 3A4, they might not necessarily have quite as much of an impact on Paxlovid therapy. So it's probably better for those patients to be continuously monitored if they are going to receive Paxlovid. One of the things to kind of keep in mind when we talk about dose is patients that are on significantly higher doses. When I think of kind of my pediatric patient population, I'm thinking like drugs like oxcarbazepine if a patient's receiving 60 mg per kilo per day or greater, or things that are kind of in excess of what we think of as being our typical dose range. Those might be able to have more of an impact on Paxlovid therapy. So for those patients in particular, we want to be much more cautious about.
Okay. Well, one of the other, I guess the corollary to this is really for both the strong inducers and more modest inducers is because, the antiviral is supposed to be started as soon as possible, right, after the COVID-19 diagnosis. What about the time course of either enzyme induction or enzyme inhibition, or perhaps more importantly, de-induction or de-inhibition? I mean, does it make sense if you're going to start your patient on, like, say, Paxlovid and they're on carbamazepine, to discontinue carbamazepine? What are your thoughts?
So one of the things to kind of keep in mind there is that de-inhibition is not going to be a very, very quick process, especially when you start to take into account other clinical pharmacokinetic factors. So let's take, for example, phenobarbital. Phenobarbital has a half-life of anywhere between 2.5 to 5 days. So if you're really trying to think about how long it's going to take that drug to get out of your system, we're thinking about 3 to 5 times that 2.5 to 5 day time frame. So thinking about how quickly we want to try and get Paxlovid started for patients, we ideally want to get it started as soon as possible following diagnosis. It really wouldn't be feasible for us to discontinue therapy for those patients. And so in that case, we might want to consider alternative treatment options.
Okay. And the same would be true for even a drug with a shorter half-life like carbamazepine. The time course for de-induction is going to be on the order of several weeks, even if following abrupt discontinuation. Okay, let me ask you one additional question here about the drug interaction. So we talked about the cytochrome P450 system in particular. What about other drug metabolizing enzyme systems like glucuronidation So would there be potentially an issue with drugs like lamotrigine? And what about drug transporter proteins like P-glycoprotein? Is there specific issues with Paxlovid we need to be concerned with?
Sure. So when we think about the effect of Paxlovid on anti-seizure medications, specifically lamotrigine, glucuronidinotransferase, or UGTs, are actually a site where ritonavir acts as an inducer. So its potential there would be that it could lower lamotrigine levels. So the patients that are receiving lamotrigine with concomitant Paxlovid, we should be doing more vigilant monitoring of the lamotrigine levels. When we think about P-glycoproteins and other protein transports, the Paxlovid therapy is an inhibitor of P-glycoprotein. So for patients that are on, say, mTOR inhibitors, it can actually increase those levels.
Okay, great. Thank you. So certainly we're going to learn more as we learn more about the dosing, what the real world ends up use of these drugs. So we've talked about some of these drug interactions, and clearly they're an issue with Paxlovid for some of our patients. So David, I'm going to go back to you. We haven't really talked about molnupiravir. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The other antiviral agent. What do we know about it, and what are the concerns there for our patients?
All right, we're all kind of struggling with pronunciation because these are brand new drugs for us, not ritonavir, but certainly other component in Paxlovid and molnupiravir. And looking at the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization from December 23rd, what we think we can glean from that is that molnupiravir is, as Jon said, it's approved only for adults. And it's not a substrate of any CYP enzymes or major drug transporters. So the in vitro studies that have been done so far, so far as we know, don't suggest any inhibitory actions. So I don't see or don't foresee any big problems with that. I think this molnupiravir really becomes probably the default choice, oral drug choice, if you want to put a patient, let's say, on one of these oral drugs, and they're on a strong enzyme-inducing anti-seizure medication, one of the four I mentioned, carb, phenytoin, phenobarbital, primidone. Well, and as Jon said, de-induction takes a long time. If you were to, even if you could, which you're not going to be able to, just stop their carbamazepine, let's say, first of all, that's going to be dangerous. It puts them at risk of seizures. And secondly, de-induction is going to take too long. You need to start something. Well, molnupiravir is seemingly at this point the obvious choice. The other option, of course, would be an IV therapy like remdesivir, which is approved and is effective. So I think that's where molnupiravir probably would come in. It has a little more toxicity and side effects. So if a patient can go on Paxlovid, if it's not going to interfere with their anti-seizure medications, okay, then use Paxlovid. But if not, then molnupiravir is going to come into play.
Dave, thank you, gentlemen, for the discussion tonight. David, I'm going to conclude with you. What then are really the take-home points we want to leave our audience with tonight about these two new therapies?
Yeah, I think for the clinicians, we're going to see these drugs used, so it's really important to understand some of these important drug-drug interactions. I just briefly mentioned a case that I had, a patient of mine who developed COVID, and we decided to prescribe Paxlovid. So he's a gentleman who was on lamotrigine, levetiracetam, and vagus nerve stimulation. So I sort of got lucky with my first case that these drugs are not going to have major interactions except the lamotrigine interaction that Jon mentioned. And he did fine. I didn't receive any complaints from him about side effects, and he certainly didn't have any seizures. So I think the takeaways are we're going to be using these oral drugs, and if Paxlovid is going to have, if patients on anti-seizure medications that Paxlovid is going to have major interactions with, we do have molnupiravir and IV therapies. We need to warn our patients that if they do experience any breakthrough seizures or any obvious adverse effects, to let us know, and that we need to be vigilant and ready to get therapeutic drug monitoring blood levels as often as we need to during the course of their treatment and afterwards as well. So I think that those are really my takeaways, Barry.
Great, and potentially consider, rescue therapies if it's appropriate.
If necessary, absolutely.
So, gentlemen, thank you again for joining me this evening, and good night to everyone.
For more information, visit the AES website at the links on the screen.